Okay, so now we're having a look at chapter 24, which is called Scroll. So in this chapter, Tong realizes that he has been approaching the mystery of the coin in the wrong way. So he realizes that it's actually much older than he thought it was, and that the way he's been looking at the hole in the middle is actually incorrect. They discover a scroll inside the bamboo cylinder as well. That's the bamboo cylinder where they actually found the other half of the coin. They are celebrating when Ke arrives home. However, he is shaken and very angry. The protests are not working and the government has declared martial law. If you remember, martial law means that the government hands over authority to the army, and they're essentially allowed to deal with problems in whichever way they like. Usually, it means that they deal with problems in a violent way. When Lee awakes the next day, Linan and Ke are arguing about going to Chengdu. He promises not to go, but is devastated not to be able to march with his friends. They tell Joan about the coin, and she is happy to learn that Linan, Tong, and Ke are her family. Tong is deciphering the scroll, and they're learning about how the coin was discovered by their ancestor and the misfortune that led to the splitting of their family. So we're gradually hearing extracts, so little sections of the scroll, which is essentially like a diary entry written by their kind of family ancestor who split the coin when he discovered it in the field, and then after famine and misfortune fell upon his family, he gave one half of the coin to each of his sons. So that's kind of how the family split in two, and how we have Leah and Joan living in Australia, and we have Tong and Linan and Ke living in Turtle Land. So the key quotes that we have in this scene. Well, it's not a Sichuan coin. Maybe it's too old to be a Shandong coin too. Maybe it is just a China coin. So here we have again the symbolism of the coin coming into play, and it ties in with ideas about the meaning of the coin that we discover later in the novel. So this idea that it's not necessarily a coin belonging to any one place, but it is in fact a coin that represents China as a whole, is something really significant given what happens later in the novel. And then another quote from the ancestor and his writing. It is an omen. She says, I have split the coin, and this means that I will split my family. Okay, so the coin comes to represent not just the meaning that it has to Joan and Leah, but it also represents the splitting of their whole family going back hundreds of years. When I get out of this blasted hospital, we are going to have to set about seeing some of China. Not for David, not my father, but for us. So we have the parallelism in this sentence. Again, with not for David, not for my father, but for us. So we have the similar structure of those kind of three phrases in that sentence. So this is Joan saying that when she's talking to Leah in the hospital, and it kind of shows how far their relationship has come, that they're no longer together just for the sake of fulfilling what their fathers wanted, but they're actually doing this together to build a close relationship for their own happiness, for their own closeness. How could Ke feel about the troubles of a man from another century when half his mind was locked away in Tiananmen? So the rhetorical question in Leah's interior monologue here, when they're kind of engaging with the mystery of the coin, but Ke is not really focused on it, because the misfortune that fell upon their family all those centuries ago, for Leah and Joan, it's very much over. But for Ke, his problems are only really just beginning. There's been no kind of improvement for him since the time when that coin was found, because he still has to struggle, he still has to deal with poverty and corruption. So while for Joan and Leah and Tong, they can kind of get caught up in that story of the coin, to Ke, it all seems very insignificant because he is so focused on those protests that are happening in Tiananmen Square. B and his wife leave Turtle Land, and I give him half of the coin I have broken, to remember us, this broken family. Perhaps he will bring it back someday. So here we have symbolism, and there's also a little bit of foreshadowing there, because we know that it has been brought back, not by B, but by Leah and Joan, his ancestors from so far down. So the symbolism of the coin, again, is seen in this quote, in that it ties in with the idea of a broken family, which is now being repaired with Joan and Leah having come back. And our final key quote that we have from this chapter, you know, the coin is China, the Politburo, the students. We did it, the Zhu and the G. Ke pushed the halves of the coin together. Why can't they? So Ke is talking about the coin, and he says the coin is China. So this broken coin, which has been split into two, is exactly the situation that we have in China's politics with the split between the students and the government. Okay, so what he's saying is if Joan and Leah can come from Australia and repair their family and join those two broken halves of the coin, then why can't the students and the government repair China and bring those two halves together again? Links to discovery that we have in this chapter. So they discover the scroll and learn the story of the coin and their ancestors. And this story has great significance to each of the characters on a different level. Leah and Ke discover more about the protests and the state of China. So as they hear from Ke's friends what's happening in Chengdu and also in Beijing, they're learning more and more about, you know, the developments that are happening. Joan discovers that they are truly family and is very happy to have found a sense of belonging with the Zhu family. Ke realizes that the broken coin can also represent China and the break between the government and the people. And Leah is starting to see that as well. So explain the metaphor in the final paragraph of chapter 24. We've kind of done that already. So the coin is broken in the same way that China is broken, with the divide between the students and the government being the same as the divide between the two halves of the coin. Okay, and Ke is trying to repair them. So then we move into chapter 25. So Ke announces to Leah and Linan that the government have stopped trains to put an end to the protests. He reveals that he is leaving for Beijing that night, and Linan is obviously very unhappy about that because she has a lot of fears for what could happen to her son. So when Ke is talking about all the places where trains have been cancelled, Leah thinks to herself, she had been there, Wuhan, Shanghai, Chengdu, Guangzhou, Chongqing. They were all part of her China, almost as much as Ke's China. So the listing of all these places and the metaphor of it being her China, obviously she doesn't own China, it doesn't belong to her, but it shows that she is kind of claiming a sense of ownership over China. She feels that she belongs to it and it belongs to her. So she kind of is viewing her heritage, her Chinese heritage, in a very, very different way now. And we start to see that her travels with her mother, even though they weren't always positive, have had an overall effect on her and her understanding of herself. And another key quote, shush, there's going to be nothing at all, but his face was pale. So this is when Ke is talking to Linan and assuring her that there's going to be no problems in Beijing. But this final sentence, but his face was pale, suggests that he is afraid and he is worried that something will happen. And that's actually foreshadowing what is going to happen at the end of the novel. So it gives us, as the reader, a bit of a bad feeling, and we start to think, oh, I don't believe what he's saying. I think that something bad will happen. Leah discovers that through her travels, she's developed a sense of belonging and ownership over China. And the other link to discovery is that Ke reveals to Leah and Lingnan that he's leaving for Beijing. So he's kind of beginning a journey of discovery for himself as a student and as a protester. So how have Leah's feelings about China changed and why? So from these statements, among others, towards the end of the novel, we see that whereas at first she was intimidated by China, she was disdainful, she looked down on it, and she had zero interest in its culture. Now Leah feels a sense of pride. It's her China. She's proud to belong to it, and she's proud to know about her heritage. And her feelings have changed because of her travels, but also because of the family that she's found and her developing relationship with Joan. What has Leah discovered about herself and her family? So she's discovered that they're closer than she thought, that Joan cares for her more than she realised, but also that, you know, something that's broken can also be repaired. In terms of her discoveries about herself, she's learning more about her identity. So she's kind of making lots of self-discoveries as she learns what she's capable of. She learns more about her history, her heritage. So Leah, throughout this journey of discovery, not only is she physically discovering China and all of its cities and the Queen and her family, she's actually discovered all of those things, but at the same time she's making emotional and mental discoveries about herself.